Hey guys, it's Thorn. I am on the iPad, which means that I never quite know where to look, but it's there. But I want to look over here. So sorry in advance. Um, I'm making this video because I was suddenly struck by the compulsion to do so after a conversation with Corvus, who was floating around on Amber and Jet, and the subject of mental illness and initiation had come up in passing. I have not read this conversation because I no longer follow Amber and Jet, but I really wanted to touch on this because on my blog I've written 2 posts specifically about Wicca and depression, and they're consistently my most viewed, most reposted blog posts, and I think that's probably indicative of a need that isn't filled. So I thought I would go ahead and do a video because this is a subject that's really important to me. And I don't think I've talked about any of this in any of my videos. I've started to at points, and I've made videos and then not posted them. But I think it's important, and increasingly so, to have this conversation. So I want to talk about mental illness and paganism broadly, and a few points about that. I want to address the subject that Corvus and I were talking about as far as mental illness and initiation in traditional groups. I want to talk about the stigma that's associated with mental illness in pagan and New Age communities. And I want to talk about mental illness and magical practice, because these are all things that are on my mind routinely. So, the first thing I want to say is that I've been diagnosed with mental illnesses, and many people have. It is extraordinarily common and increasingly so, and part of the reason for this is because mental illness is actually a social construction, and what constitutes a mental illness changes often within the span of only a decade or so, right? Like, you know, at one point in American history, homosexuality is categorized as a mental illness, and people are put in treatment centers to recover from homosexuality. So, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is kind of this nebulous category that historically has been sort of a resting place for problematic women with self-injury tendencies who nobody really knew what to do with. And this diagnosis had particular impact in terms of how I qualified for health insurance, how people treated me, and anyway, like, suddenly borderline personality disorder isn't really a thing anymore. Like, I don't know what the hell they're calling it now, but it's always been kind of this nebulous catch-all thing, and whether or not it's really a thing, I don't know. You know, like, you want to talk about mental illness being socially constructed, I think borderline personality disorder is a good place to start. So anyway, I'm telling you this because I want to make it clear that you can be diagnosed with mental illness and you can still be a high-functioning person who can operate a coven and graduate a whole bunch of times from college and pay your taxes and buy a fucking house, all right? Right, Oliver? And take care of a cat. The conversation that usually happens around whether or not people who are mentally ill should be considered for inclusion in pagan groups is usually based on the assumption that people who are mentally ill are somehow not as apt to function well as other people, right? But you know what? I've also been diagnosed with clinical depression. I've self-injured since I was a child, and none of these things have gotten in the way of my performance as a priestess, as a functioning coven member, and as a reasonable human being. I pass for normal every day. People are often surprised to hear that I've had various kinds of experiences and been subject to various diagnoses. And it's not because I'm tricking anybody. It's because mental illness is not this crippling, stigmatizing thing that everybody thinks it is. Which is not to say that there aren't people out there who are not getting the treatment they need, people who we don't know how to treat, right? I'm not saying that it's, you know, a pass card for everybody, but the assumption that if you're struggling with a mental illness, you automatically can't function in some kind of like serious spiritual setting is so incredibly problematic, and it makes me want to scream every time somebody asks whether or not you should consider for initiation somebody who's depressed or somebody who has PTSD or somebody who whatever, because the other side of that is that everybody else is normal, and the reality is that everybody has their shit. The question is, how well are you dealing with it? And just because I have to take antidepressants or just because I have to go to a lot of fucking therapy or whatever doesn't mean that I'm not a high-functioning, very stable human being. I have particular, frankly, medical concerns that do not impact my performance as a witch or a priestess any more than somebody who might be diabetic and needs special needs and has special needs. Or, everybody has their thing. And I think that there are ways to accommodate those things, and it's a problem when we stigmatize people who struggle with mental illness. Just because I also think it overlooks the fact that a ridiculous fucking number of people struggle with mental illness, and we just don't talk about it because we're shamed into not talking about it. And that's a problem. So, anyway, so beyond that, I wanted to kind of touch on, this is what I touched on in those blog posts. I run into this attitude all over metaphysical, pagan, Wiccan, New Age communities. Not so much witch communities, but metaphysical spaces. And that is, again, a kind of stigma against mental illness. And I think it's rooted in this idea that we're all supposed to have some kind of like total power over our lives, where if we just like send out positive vibes, or if we just visualize hard enough, or if we just have the right attitude, good things will happen to us. The assumption is that we have this level of power to impact what goes on in our life. And oftentimes metaphysical folks, pagans, New Agers, whatever, will talk about these things in terms of karma or visualizing or whatever. And there aren't a lot of really serious conversations about this. Usually what happens is you see shit recycled in the form of memes, right? So like there's one meme that floats across my Instagram dash pretty routinely, and it says something to the effect of, nature is cheaper than therapy, right? And like, that's a sweet message, okay? But it's also full of shit, because the reason nature is cheaper than therapy is because nature doesn't cure clinical depression, right? Like, it doesn't cure a lot of the things that people go to therapy for. That's not to say that nature isn't helpful for some people. That isn't to say that we shouldn't be seeking that thing out necessarily. But the implication of that meme, like the insidious kind of message behind the meme, is that people who are in therapy are somehow not doing it right. They're not close enough to nature. They're not spiritual enough, that there's something wrong with the person who's in therapy because they're not addressing some spiritual need, right? Other things that you hear are, people have problems with, right, like Western medicine, and this idea that if you take an SSRI, if you take medication for your depression or for whatever your mental illness is, that you're somehow poisoning your body, and that the real solution is you just need to drink more herbal tea or something. Again, I'm not saying that herbal tea is not enormously beneficial for some people or that you shouldn't drink it. I'm saying that for some people, a lot of people, that's just not enough. And what happens is these conversations sort of inadvertently shame those of us who take medication, who go to therapy, who do all of these things that are less than magical, right? Like, there's nothing particularly attractive and magical about like going to a psychiatrist and having to go through like 7 different SSRIs before you find one that doesn't make you want to fucking kill yourself. Like it's not pretty. And it's easier to make memes about how, like, well, the Wiccan Rede tells us that we shouldn't harm ourselves either, which means that we shouldn't cut ourselves. And if you cut yourself, it means you're doing Wicca wrong, right? And it sounds assholish to say it out loud because it is assholish. And you know what? If that's your interpretation of the Rede and that keeps you from cutting yourself, you know what? That's awesome. More power to you. Anything that keeps you from cutting yourself, I'm all for. But the assumption that everybody else is doing Wicca wrong or not following the Rede or whatever, like, that just makes you an asshole. Okay? Because these are clinical, these are medical conditions that for most of us require more than hiking and like balancing our chakras with crystals or whatever. I'm not saying that those things aren't helpful. I have gotten so much out of massage, out of ritual, out of meditation. You know, all of those things are beneficial. I'm not discounting those things. All I'm saying is that there's a problem with the attitude that we should be shunning sort of conventional medical psychiatric care for some of these conditions. Like, that's a problem. And all that does is silence the people in our community who have these very real, life-threatening, often, struggles, who then can't turn to their community for help because they're going to be told basically that they're doing paganism wrong, or they're not believing in themselves hard enough. Like, if they just read The Secret one more time and, like, you know, it's all about the law of attraction or whatever, then they wouldn't have to spend so much money on therapy, right? And most people aren't even lucky enough to be able to afford therapy. But I don't even have time to get into that. So those are things that I think just as a community, like whatever your magical community consists of, like those are things that I think we all need to somehow address collectively. The third thing, which I'll only talk about for a second, well, I'm probably lying. The third thing is one thing that I've explored in my writings about witchcraft specifically, as opposed to paganism broadly or other kinds of metaphysical things or even Wicca, is this idea that the witch is sort of inherently some kind of outsider, right? She sort of necessarily inhabits a liminal space. And you know, you can go to my blog and read about that, more of that stuff in detail. But to me, I think mental illness can be part of that in a constructive way. For me, I've reframed my own struggles with the borderline stuff and with the depression stuff and even with the cutting, in terms of those kinds of altered states where magic happens, frankly, which is not to romanticize or glorify mental illness, only to point out that historically mental illness and physical illness have been factors in determining whether or not people were witches. And I don't think those are things that we can just necessarily brush off. I think they're really interesting. I've often wondered if some of the magical experiences I've had would have been possible if it weren't for some of my dissociative tendencies, for example. Which, again, I don't mean to glorify. I would rather not struggle with mental illness. But I don't want to discount either the role, especially the historical role, that some of these conditions have played in, you know, witchcraft in other parts of the world or witchcraft historically, etc. I think those are interesting things to consider, and those are always conversations I enjoy having, especially with other people who struggle with mental illness. So anyway, I'm trying to talk really fast because I feel like I have a lot to say. But I'm going to leave it at that. I'll post the blog shit below if people are interested. I'm also going to tack on really quick. I always feel like I need to tack on a disclaimer when I talk about my own mental illness stuff, which I don't do frequently. But just so everybody knows, I have been in treatment for many years. I'm fine. I am a functioning person. I have a very solid support system. I am not currently self-injuring. I'm fine, seriously. I'm not talking about this stuff to garner any kind of sympathy, and I don't need, you know, like, I don't need sympathy. Okay. The best way to help generally is to just educate yourself and try to be compassionate as far as the people in your own life who have comparable struggles. You know, like, be aware of that and try not to participate in that kind of like collective religious paradigm where we think that the mentally ill are not worthy of being initiated into the mysteries ultimately, or, you know, the mentally ill aren't, you know, visualizing hard enough their wellness or something like that, or they need to spend more time in nature. So anyway, that's all. I hope everybody has a good night, and I'm gonna go cuddle Oliver now.